June 16th, 1815. A crossroads in Belgium. Napoleon's plan was working perfectly. His army had driven between Wellington and the Prussians. The two Allied forces were separated. The crossroads at Quatre Bras, the only road connecting them, was held by fewer than 8,000 militia. Marshal Ney had 24,000 men and orders to take it before dawn. Wellington was miles away, at a ball. If Ney moved that morning, the Allied armies could never reach each other. Napoleon would destroy them separately. There would be no Waterloo. There would be no 100 days ending in defeat. There might be no end at all. Ney did not move that morning. Why a Marshal of France, with every advantage, froze at the moment that mattered most, and what it cost Napoleon, is a story about psychology, phantom armies, a Dutch officer who disobeyed orders, and Scottish soldiers fighting blind in wheat fields 6 feet tall. This is Quatre Bras, the battle that made Waterloo possible. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we are covering the Battle of Quatre Bras, the engagement 2 days before Waterloo that most people have never heard of, and without which Waterloo could never have happened. But before we get to those crossroads and the Scottish regiments fighting in wheat fields so tall they couldn't see the cavalry coming, we need to understand what Napoleon was trying to do, and how close he came to doing it. Napoleon returned from Elba in March 1815 to find Europe assembling against him. The 7th Coalition was mobilising. 500,000 men were moving toward France's borders from every direction. Napoleon's only option was to attack before they could combine, to take his army into Belgium, destroy Wellington and Blucher separately, knock Britain and Prussia out of the coalition, and then deal with Austria and Russia from a position of strength. The strategy was called the central position. Drive between the enemy armies, face one with a containing force while destroying the other with the main body, then turn. Napoleon had done it before. Done well, it was almost irresistible. Wellington knew an attack was coming. What he didn't know was where. His intelligence had suggested the French might move through Mons to the west, threatening his supply lines to the coast. He positioned his army accordingly, spread across a wide front, with significant forces covering the western approaches. When the French crossed the Sambre on June 15th and moved directly north through Charleroi, Wellington was caught out of position by the better part of a day's march. The person who saved him from the consequences of this miscalculation was not Wellington. It was a Dutch staff officer named Constant Rebec. Rebec was serving under the Prince of Orange, who commanded the Allied First Corps. On the afternoon of June 15th, as French forces poured through Charleroi and moved north, Rebec understood that the crossroads at Quatre Bras was the hinge on which everything turned. If the French took it, the road between Wellington's army and Blucher's Prussians would be cut. The two armies could not support each other. Napoleon's central position strategy would work. Wellington's orders were for the First Corps to concentrate at Nivelles to the west. Rebec looked at those orders, looked at the situation, and decided to disobey them. He directed the Dutch 2nd Division, under General Perponcher, to hold Quatre Bras instead. A Nassau brigade under Prince Bernhard of Saxe-Weimar arrived at the crossroads in the early afternoon of June 15th, skirmished with French light cavalry, and held on. The crossroads was not empty when Ney arrived. It had defenders. Not many, but enough. The night of June 15th was when the social world of Brussels and the military world of the campaign collided in the most famous way. The Duchess of Richmond gave a ball. Wellington had approved it, partly to maintain the appearance of calm, partly to deny the city's French population any obvious signs of alarm. The great rooms of her house in the Rue des Cendres were hung with rose-patterned paper and lit by chandeliers. The senior officers of the Allied army were there, along with the diplomatic corps and the cream of Brussels society. Late in the evening, a dispatch arrived. The French were at Charleroi. They were moving north. Wellington read the message, kept his seat for a few minutes more, then asked his host quietly if he had a good map. The two men withdrew. Wellington studied the situation and understood what had happened. He had been, as he acknowledged later, humbugged. Napoleon had gained a full day's march on him by moving through the centre rather than the west as Wellington had expected. He gave his orders quietly. The army was to concentrate, some divisions at Quatre Bras, others at Nivelles. Then he rejoined the ball long enough to avoid creating panic and went home to sleep. The subalterns and captains who had been dancing in silk stockings and dancing slippers found themselves quietly summoned, handed their swords, and sent to rejoin their regiments in the darkness. Some of them were still in their evening dress when they reached the battlefield the following day. Wellington himself arrived at Quatre Bras around 3 in the afternoon of June 16th. He had ridden there from Ligny, where he had already visited Blucher and assessed the Prussian position. A position he privately thought dangerously exposed. The situation at Quatre Bras when he arrived was desperate. Paponcha's Dutch and Belgian troops had been fighting since 2 o'clock, outgunned and outnumbered, holding a line that was bending under French pressure. The crossroads was nearly lost. Ney had 24,000 men and had waited 6 hours to use them. The delay was caused partly by his subordinate General Reilly, a Peninsular War veteran who knew Wellington's reverse slope tactics and believed the crops and woods around Quatre Bras must be concealing a vast British army in the English manner. They were not. There were 8,000 militia and a few thousand regular troops. But Reilly's caution and Ney's own psychological turbulence from the Russian campaign combined to produce 6 wasted hours that allowed Wellington's reinforcements to begin arriving. The terrain around Quatre Bras was not empty ground. To the southwest, the Bossu wood ran for nearly a mile, thick, tangled, and full of undergrowth that turned infantry combat into a confused, close-range struggle among the trees. In the fields between the wood and the road, rye, wheat, and corn had grown to nearly 6 feet, above the height of a man. Cavalry could move through this without being seen from more than a few yards away. So could infantry. The battlefield was a place where visibility was measured in steps, and where surprise could be fatal. General Picton's 5th Division arrived in the early afternoon and took position on the left, along the Namur Road. Picton was one of the most experienced divisional commanders in the British Army. Abrasive, profane, beloved by his soldiers in the way that effective commanders who share their danger tend to be. He arrived still wearing the civilian clothes and the top hat he had on when the orders reached him, having had no time to change. The 5th Division went into line still marching, and the fighting around Quatre Bras intensified immediately. The rye fields were where the Highland regiments nearly came apart. General Pack's brigade included the 42nd Black Watch, the 79th Cameron Highlanders, the 92nd Gordon Highlanders, and the 44th East Essex. These were among the most experienced battalions in the army, veterans of the peninsula, soldiers who had fought at Salamanca and Vittoria and Badajoz. They had never fought in standing crops 6 feet tall. The standard defence against cavalry was the infantry square. 4 ranks of men forming a hollow rectangle, bayonets pointing outward in every direction. Horses would not charge into bayonets. The square was impenetrable to cavalry as long as it could be formed in time. The problem at Quatre Bras was that the rye was so tall that the cavalry couldn't be seen until it was 30 yards away, and 30 yards at a gallop was no time at all. The 44th were caught before the ray could form. French lancers broke through them, killing and scattering. The 42nd Black Watch was still forming when the cavalry hit, and lancers rode into the partially formed square. The fighting inside the collapsing formation was at arm's length, men using their muskets as clubs, bayonets stabbing upward at riders who were cutting down from the saddle. The commanding officer of the 42nd, Lieutenant Colonel Macara, had already been wounded and was being carried from the field. The lancers found him. He was killed where he lay. The 42nd held on. The veterans who survived the initial impact closed the square by sheer collective stubbornness, sealed the gaps, and the lancers could not break what they could not penetrate. The formation locked, stabilised, and held. Wellington later said that what the Highland regiments did at Quatre Bras was as fine a thing as he had seen soldiers do. The Gordon Highlanders fought in the same fields and lost their commanding officer, Colonel Cameron of Fassifern, shot from his horse. He was carried back by his kinsman and personal servant, Ewan Macmillan, and died the following day. The Gordons, it was said, fought the rest of the battle for him. The Brunswick contingent arrived in the afternoon, about 5,000 men in black uniforms bearing a silver skull and crossbones on their shakos. Their Duke, Frederick William, had raised them from his own resources after Napoleon destroyed his duchy in 1806 and killed his father at the Battle of Jena. They had been waiting 9 years to fight the French. They were not the most experienced soldiers on the field, but they were among the most motivated. The Duke led them personally, riding along the front of his battalions under fire, pipe in his mouth, trying to hold the line as the Brunswickers wavered under French artillery. A musket ball struck him down as he rallied his men. His staff caught him as he fell. He was carried to a farmhouse and died within an hour. His men, when they heard, steadied rather than broke, and 2 days later at Waterloo they would fight with a ferocity that everyone who saw them attributed to having something personal to settle. The most bizarre episode of the day came in the afternoon. Marshal Ney, frustrated by hours of combat that had produced no breakthrough, sent orders to General d'Erlon and his First Corps, 20,000 men marching toward Quatre Bras, to come and settle the battle. D'Erlon's column changed direction and moved toward Quatre Bras. Then a staff officer arrived from Napoleon's headquarters with orders for d'Erlon to turn east towards Ligny, where Napoleon was fighting the Prussians and needed a flanking force to complete their destruction. D'Erlon turned east. He was almost at Ligny when a furious Ney sent yet another order recalling him to Quatre Bras. D'Erlon turned west again. He spent the entire day marching between two battlefields. He reached neither. His 20,000 men fired not a shot all day. At Ligny, where his corps arriving on the Prussian flank might have turned a French victory into an annihilation, he was absent. At Quatre Bras, where his corps arriving on Wellington's exposed position might have ended the battle in an afternoon, he was absent. The order that sent him east was probably improvised by an enthusiastic staff officer. It may never have been authorised by Napoleon at all. No one ever established exactly what happened. Ney's last throw was General Kellermann's heavy cavalry brigade. Cuirassiers, armoured in steel breastplates and helmets with horsehair crests, the most powerful shock troops in the French army. Ney sent them against the crossroads without infantry support, without artillery preparation, without any of the conditions under which cavalry could be expected to succeed against formed infantry. He sent them because he had nothing else left. Kellermann protested. Ney, who was by this point in a state that eyewitnesses described as barely controlled fury, told him to go now. They went. And for a few extraordinary minutes it worked. The cuirassiers burst through the 69th South Lincolnshire Regiment, which had no time to form square, took their colours, scattered several battalions, and reached the crossroads itself. According to legend, Wellington, caught in the open, galloped for the nearest formed unit, the 92nd Gordons, and cleared their bayonets with his horse, landing inside the square as the French cavalry surged around it. Then a British artillery battery opened on the cuirassiers from close range, and infantry reserves that had not been engaged closed in from both sides. Kellermann's horse was shot beneath him. He retreated on foot, hanging from the stirrups of other riders. The breakthrough that had reached the crossroads was repulsed in minutes. Ney had nothing more to throw. By nightfall, Wellington held the crossroads. The French were back where they had started. The losses on both sides were roughly equal, around 5,000 casualties each. Strategically, Wellington had held what he needed to hold. The connection with Blücher's Prussians remained open. But Blücher had been beaten at Ligny, not destroyed. The Prussian army was retreating north rather than east, meaning it could still support Wellington, but beaten. The next morning, Wellington learned that Blücher had fallen back. There was no longer any purpose in holding Quatre Bras. Wellington ordered his army to withdraw north to the ridge above the village of Waterloo, and the rain came. Napoleon had won at Ligny, but not completely. D'Erlon's absence had prevented the crushing blow that might have ended Blücher's army as a fighting force. The Prussians were retreating north, not broken. And now a rainstorm of unusual violence, the volcanic winter lingering from Tambora's eruption in April, turned the roads between Quatre Bras and Waterloo into mud through which artillery and cavalry could barely move. The French pursuit was slow. Wellington's army reached the Waterloo position intact. Quatre Bras cost Wellington's army a high butcher's bill and gave him nothing that could be called a clean victory. But it kept the crossroads. It kept the road between the two Allied armies open. When Blücher sent his Prussians marching west toward Waterloo on the afternoon of June 18th, the road they used was the same road that had been fought over 2 days before. If Ney had taken it in the morning of June 16th, as he was supposed to, those Prussians would never have arrived. The battle that most people don't know saved the battle that everyone does. That is what happened at Quatre Bras.